I genuinely don't understand what's going on with Harbor. When you're playing an agent and you feel bad for playing said agent, you feel like a detriment not only to your team, but as a player, you feel like you are at a disadvantage. That is fundamentally wrong, especially in a tactical shooter. For a game that prides itself in giving the players as many different options and opportunities to create variables, to have different sorts of games and tools at the disposal of a player, having one agent be an abysmal choice in a category that honestly is already very top heavy doesn't really seem to align with that. Harbor is by far the least used agent, and there's no surprise there. But when you compare it to his counterparts and some of the other controllers, not every controller has been a success, but there is one in particular that is arguably one of the most used agents, period, in Valorant. And so when you have such a drastic difference between the worst agent and arguably the best one in the game, there's an issue. At the core, Harbor's kit revolves around water. His signature ability, High Tide, is a wall of water that you deploy by using your cursor, glancing at the minimap, and hoping that you align the wall with whatever it is that you're trying to align it with. It's an interesting way, and very distinct way, to deploy a smoke in comparison to all the other agents. His secondary abilities, the Cascade being a water wall that moves with you or in front of you, is a unique take on what is traditionally a smoke ability. This is probably one of my more favorite abilities of his kit, but there's still much left to be desired. His bubble, the Cove, was an interesting ability that many players at first speculated would have tremendous impacts on the meta at the time, and an ability that many were scared of because of its ability to completely block off bullets. And in a post-plant situation, how impactful could this ability be? And I would say the biggest component to his kit, that is the only redeeming quality that Harbor seems to have, would be his ultimate. And within this area of effect, any enemy trapped within it will be given a warning as a geyser shoots up and temporarily stuns them in place if they are caught within the geyser. You obviously, as the enemy, have the ability to move out of it, and there's nothing that prevents you from doing so. So if you are paying attention, you can quickly play around this ultimate and not really face any consequences. But it's not a bad ability in the sense that it still draws the attention from the enemies, and if you are already having a bad push, might make you think twice about continuing with said push and pulling back with your team. Harbor was released in October of 2022, and since his initial release has only really experienced two specific changes. A month after his release, his two walls, Cascade and High Tide, were increased in the amount of time that they stayed deployed. He also received an additional charge for his Cascade. His second and only change came in February of this year, back when Riot made the changes to all of these different abilities in making sure that they were also slowing down dashes, specifically when Waylay came out. So if your ability was already stunning players, it now was also going to slow down the speed of an enemy player using a dash. Besides those two changes, nothing. Everybody in the Valorant community is speculating that Harbor is going to get a change. But what does this change look like, and why is it so warranted? Because besides the fact that Harbor is the least used agent in all of the different agents that Valorant has to offer, the controller category isn't technically doing all that bad. If we were to look at the 6 controllers, Astra, Brim, Clove, Harbor, Omen, and Viper, it's really only Harbor, Viper, and Astra that probably see the least amount of play. As you know, having a controller on your team is a must, so you're almost always going to see Clove and Brim, if not Omen, from time to time. What is the point of a controller? These agents are meant to assist teammates by cutting enemy vision, taking control of an area, and forcing enemies into a choke point. If we dissect Harbor, Harbor definitely cuts off enemy vision, doesn't really take control of an area or force enemies into a choke point if it's not for the exception of his ult. But if we look at the other agents, Brim and Viper can damage enemies directly with their abilities. Harbor is part of a group with Astra, Clove, Omen, and Viper that can cause a status to an enemy, because if you are hit by his geyser during his ult, you technically are stunned for a moment. And obviously they all have smokes. But except for Harbor, the 5 other controllers have a heads-up display that they use to deploy their smokes. Harbor has the unique characteristic that you are physically deploying your wall of water that is your primary signature move. You are controlling how that wall is deployed, but because of that, you don't have a heads-up display like everybody else that can deploy their smokes over the minimap. Even Viper, who uses a wall smoke, who's the only other agent that has this type of ability, while less flexible, can not only keep her smoke up longer, but also gives more control to the player because you have the ability to redeploy that wall whenever you want. Harbor's only goes up once, and after being deployed once, has to wait 40 seconds to use again. An ability that is already considered by many to be quite useless is an ability that you have to sit around and wait 40 seconds to have once again. So how do we improve Harbor? If you were to stay with a similar kit, you have to change something with his wall. I would say adding a multiplier. If you shoot through his smoke, you do more damage. Or if you get shot through the smoke, you take less damage. His abilities are already pretty infrequent when it comes to their usage during match, so I don't think this would be too far-fetched and would actually align pretty well with this current philosophy on his usage of abilities. If you wanted to drastically change him, considering he's a water agent, perhaps going down the area of effect ability. An ability that would be more in line with one of these aspects of being a controller, such as creating an area covered in water where movement is slowed, or you gradually become vulnerable, etc. By far though, his ability deployment has to be changed. I would argue, except for his cascade. I think Harbor being the only agent that can move alongside his smoke makes him unique, because that wall will continue to move forward until it eventually reaches its limit, or until you as a player choose to stop the wall. It can be useful for pushing up with cover, and I think that type of usage is really good in comparison to the other controllers, because they don't have that type of ability. However, his signature ability should be deployable through a HUD. And specifically, the change would have to be so that the wall rises from the ground instantly, rather than gradually over time. If you've ever played Harbor, you not only have to wait until you fully extend out your wall, or until you manually cancel the length of the wall. It starts from where you activated the ability to the end of the wall. It's gradual instead of instantly. You could, even with the heads-up display, keep the flexibility and allow the player to make a curve on the wall using their cursor. I think it would create a skill gap, but it would be a pretty manageable one in my opinion. And if we're talking about his ultimate, I think that's actually probably fine. You could technically decrease the cost of his ultimate. I think it might be too much of a drastic change. It might even be overcompensating. I think the only good thing that Harbor has at this point is his ultimate ability. And then giving Harbor a damaging move doesn't really make sense, but I also have to say that his bubble just doesn't really seem to be cutting it right now. Something that's closer to a geyser, for example, like a much smaller and targeted version of his ultimate, would be interesting to see instead, especially because it would be aligning with one of the other characteristics of a controller of forcing enemy players to move out of a position. If you could target where a geyser would show up, it would not only force that player into moving out of that position, but it could help in clearing certain choke spots for your teammates. Again, I think the bubble was really popular when he first came out, but in this day and age, almost every player is shooting at everything at any given time. And these are some of the small changes that I would recommend to Harbor. I don't think it's worth the time to go into and theorize about it because this has been something that the community has been discussing for a long time now. I think at this point, there is no way Riot isn't working on a change to Harbor. Whether it's a good one or bad one, honestly, I don't think it really matters at this point because fundamentally, as Harbor currently stands, he's just not viable. And that in and of itself warrants a mandatory change. With that said, thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Peace out.